Ossining, New York, June 12, 1941. 10:59 p.m. Harry Strauss sits in a cell on death row. Once one of the top torpedoes of the gang of underworld assassins dubbed Murder Incorporated, he is now simply inmate number 98648. Back in New York City, the underworld refers to him as Pittsburgh Phil, probably after a famous gambler from the beginning of the century who was a fancy dresser. Some called him Big Harry. To those close to him, or at least on an even keel or higher up, he is Pep. One of his partners in slaughter, Martin Bugsy Goldstein, shuffles past his cell to keep his appointment with the executioner. A minute later the lights flicker. Bugsy is paying his debt to society. Pep has just 6 minutes to live. Strauss never saw it coming. When he was picked up for vagrancy in January of 1940, along with almost a dozen of his cohorts, he, like them, assumed that it was a routine arrest. The new district attorney said he was going to clean up Brooklyn, and the apprehensions appeared to be a simple ploy for the DA to get some headlines for himself. Pep wasn't worried. He'd been arrested 27 times over the past 13 years and they never pinned a thing on him. Described by Assistant DA Burton Turkis as the most lustful killer of the Murder Incorporated assassins, Strauss seemed to relish taking life. Once, Albert Anastasia told him about a guy he wanted to have hit. When Strauss learned later that the guy had been bumped off, he lamented to his pal Abe Relis, "It's too bad. I wanted to lend a hand with it." Though only found guilty of one, it is believed that Strauss may have taken part in 30-plus gangland executions in various cities across the country. Following are 17 murders in which the DA's office determined that Strauss definitely had a hand in. The allegations come from confessions made by his Confederates who sang during the investigations of 1940 and 1941. Before beginning, let's take a moment to meet the cast of this deadly saga. Anthony Maffitor called Duke and Abe Levine, aka Pretty, whom Strauss referred to as the Kids. They were used for grunt work like stealing cars, and then dumping them once a body was in the back seat. Abe Kid Twist Relis and Martin Bugsy Goldstein, who along with Strauss made up the triumvirate of evil in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Harry Happy Mayone, Frank the Dasher Abendando and Vito Guarino. Strauss's, Relis and Goldstein's counterparts in neighboring Ocean Hill. Together they made up what Relis called the combination. Louis Capone, a subordinate of Albert Anastasia who started giving the combination murder contracts in the early 30s. He was their key to the syndicate. Walter Sage, one of the Brownsville boys going back to the early days. Louis Lepke Buckleter, the country's top labor racketeer. He had close ties to Albert Anastasia. Mendy Weiss and Ali Tick-Tock Tannenbaum, two of Lepke's gunmen. Roco Morgandy was a contract job for Louis Capone. It may have been retaliation for a shooting in 1928, or, according to the book, Murder Incorporated, Morgandy was a racketeer in a painters' labor union somebody wanted out of the way. Either way, Capone chose Strauss and Relis for the job. On October 16, 1932, Morgandy was lured to a poker game in a third-story apartment. While the game was in progress, Capone pulled up out front and Relis, Strauss, and a third gunman entered the apartment. The card players were lined up against the wall. Once Morgandy was isolated, Relis and Strauss fired several bullets into him. Fria was a contract handed down by mobster Joe Adonis, and it went to Happy Mayone since he was friendly with the victim. On the evening of May 25, 1933, Mayone, along with Vito Guarino and Strauss, picked up Fria in a Cadillac owned by Abe Relis. At some point the guns came out and Fria was shot to death. Unfortunately for Relis, the victim was holding onto a door strap when killed. The murderers were unable to undo Frisch's death grip and they tossed the corpse into the street, the strap still clutched in its hand. Relis was none the happy to have a dead man holding a piece of his car and paid Adonis a visit. Seeing things through Relis' eyes, the gangster gave him $800 to buy a new car. The total collapse and disintegration of Murder Incorporated can be traced back to this murder. Even though he didn't take part in the actual killing, the murder of Red Alpert was arguably the most consequential of Strauss's career because it led to the Murder Inc. investigations of 1940 that resulted in not only the death of Strauss, but 6 of his Confederates and the long prison sentences of others. Although Abe Reles gets the blame for bringing down Murder Inc., his decision to sing was the result of this murder, which can be traced back to the fact that Strauss was cheap. A seasoned hoodlum by the age of 19, Red Alpert managed to steal a cache of precious gems supposedly worth upwards of 10 grand. Not having the connections to move the stuff, he approached Strauss and offered them to him for the bargain rate of $3,000. Strauss offered $700. In not too polite terms, Alpert declined Strauss's offer. Strauss called on Pretty Levine and a pal to bring Alpert in, but they failed. Next, Reles and Goldstein paid Alpert a visit and told him that Strauss wanted the gems and he wanted them for $700. Alpert told them to go to hell too, which was akin to signing his own death warrant. After the news was delivered, Strauss, with the blessing of Louis Capone, decided that Alpert had to go. Walter Sage, who was friendly with Alpert, was given the job. The following day, November 25, 1933, Sage stopped by Alpert's home. The two men left together, and after walking about a block, Sage drew a gun and killed his friend. Over the course of a year, 1930 to 1931, the combination fought a war in Brownsville with a gang headed by 2 brothers, Meyer and Irving Shapiro. By the fall of '31, both brothers had been eliminated and were no longer a threat to the combination. Time passed, and on the evening of July 18, 1934, Vito Guarino joined the gang on a Brownsville corner and casually mentioned that he had just seen Willie Shapiro, the younger brother of Meyer and Irving, who was not involved in the rackets. "You know, we've got nothing to do right now," Strauss told his cohorts. "Why don't we take him tonight and be done with it?" Even though Willie was in no way a threat to the combination, it was determined that he should be removed just for insurance. Somehow Strauss, Happy Mayone, Dasher Abinando and Vito Guarino got Willie into a car and hauled him into the basement of a bar ran by Mayone's brother-in-law. There, the 23-year-old was brutally beaten. His skull, jaw and wrists were broken, and his body from the neck down to the waist was one uninterrupted bruise. In what would become a Pittsburgh Phil signature, a long piece of cord was wrapped around his throat and tied around his hands and then feet. In the event of his struggling, the cord would wrap tighter around his throat, strangling him. Willie was then stuffed into a large burlap sack. His executioners transported his body to Canarsie and buried him in the sand, where a Samaritan uncovered him the following day. Anthony Di Sama owned the Vesuvio Espresso Cafe, a small coffee shop in Coney Island. According to the press and DA files, a mob guy named Dominic Pepito aka Joe Pitt tried shaking Di Sama down, but the cafe owner refused to pay. The combination received the contract and Mayone and Strauss were given the job. On the evening of June 4, 1935, the duo entered the cafe and fired shots into Di Sama's head and chest. Irving Amron was part of a gang that kidnapped a mafia bookie in 1935. Because Amron was acquainted with Walter Sage, the Brownsville killers got the contract. Abraham Mir was used as part of the ruse to get at Amron. Though Mir hadn't done anything wrong, it didn't matter. He would be used and then bumped off. On September 15, 1935, Amron and Mir ventured to Brownsville, where Walter Sage and Duke Mafator picked them up. They drove to a specific location. When they arrived, the hoodlums were approached by Strauss and Goldstein, who were posing as detectives. Amron and Mir were ordered to stand up against the garage wall. Strauss and Goldstein whipped out sawed-off shotguns and opened fire. Strauss killed Mir, but Goldstein somehow missed Amron. Amron was then hustled into a car and taken to a place where Strauss and Goldstein questioned him for hours. Meanwhile, Mir's body had been discovered and detectives were working on the case. Strauss and Goldstein promised Amron that they would let him go if he gave up information regarding the kidnapping of the mafia bookie. After getting what information they could out of him, they kept their promise and let him go. Maffitor and Sage picked him up to give him a ride home. Within a few minutes Sage drew a gun and fired a number of shots into his head. Amron's corpse was left in the car and found an hour or so later. Meehan was a former associate of Legs Diamond and a gangster from Manhattan's West Side. Supposedly he ventured into Brooklyn and tried to muscle in on operations in Brownsville. A meeting was set up at a Brooklyn bar on June 5, 1936. Yon, Dasher Abendano and Strauss showed up and shot Meehan numerous times. He died a short time later. The murder of Jack Goldstein was both personal and business for Strauss. Goldstein, age 24, was a rackets guy involved in the Fulton fish market. Strauss had had issues with him from the past. Goldstein was involved with a woman named Evelyn Middleman. She had numerous underworld boyfriends who had a bad habit of winding up dead whenever Middleman caught another hoodlum's eye. In 1935 Goldstein bumped off Middleman's then-boyfriend and claimed her as his own. Goldstein and Middleman were an item until Pittsburgh Phil got a look at her. Turkis tells us that Pep and Goldstein went at it in a pool hall one night and Pep tore up Goldstein's face with a pool cue. Afterwards Middleman would be found on Pep's arm. In the summer of 1936 there was an investigation into racketeering at the Fulton fish market and the boss of the operation, Joseph Sox Lanza, decided it would be safer for him if Goldstein was taken care of. Goldstein, we are told, had decided to go straight, a death sentence in the underworld. By that August he had remarried and was honeymooning in the Catskills. Strauss happened to be up there as well, so when the order came to take Goldstein, Pep got the contract. Duke Maffitor and Pretty Levine were sent to the Catskills and told to report to Strauss. Knowing that Goldstein would never go near him, Strauss had Maffitor and Levine concoct some reason for the newlywed to step away from his bride. The duo plus a few others phoned Goldstein with some story and pulled up to his cabin around 9 p.m. on August 3. Goldstein told his wife he'd be right back. He got into the car and as they pulled off Maffitor grabbed him and Pretty Levine knocked him out with a blow from a hammer. They had strict orders from Strauss that they were not to kill him. They delivered the unconscious Goldstein to Strauss at Loch Sheldrake, who produced a length of clothesline and tied him up, knotting the rope around his neck, hands and feet, in such a fashion that if he struggled, he would strangle himself. Once the victim was bound, he was wrapped up in a blanket and put in a boat. His assassins rowed out to the middle of the lake and Strauss tossed him in himself, settling both an old score and a contract. Goldstein's body was never found. Ashkenaz was most likely feeding information to then District Attorney Thomas Dewey during his investigation of Louis Lepke Buckleter. He had done time for second-degree manslaughter after a slamming in 1930 of a dress manufacturer during a garment strike. Given 5 to 15 years, he was paroled in 1934. By 1936 Ashkenaz was managing a taxi service that chauffeured people from New York City to the Catskills. He may have been using trips there to gather info for the Dewey investigation. Lepke learned of his talking and put out a contract on him. Details are that Strauss, Irving Gang E. Cohen and Tick-Tock Tannenbaum shot him to pieces outside a motel in the town of Hurleyville. Joe Rosen was part owner of a trucking concern that was forced out of business by Lepke Buckleter. Rosen managed to eke out a living by running a small candy store in Brownsville for several months. In the summer of 1936 Lepke caught wind that the scorned trucker was threatening to talk to Thomas Dewey, so put out a contract. Lepke's man, Mendy Weiss, was to be the shooter. Pittsburgh Phil would enter the store with him for support if necessary. Weiss instructed Pep that he was to do no shooting. Jimmy Farrico would stand by the door making sure nobody got in. Sholem Bernstein would be driving. On the morning of September 13, 1936, the three killers stood in the vestibule of a building waiting for Rosen to exit his house and open his store. After about an hour they saw him cross the street and enter his shop. The trio approached the store as Bernstein pulled up outside. Fria stood guard out front as Weiss and Strauss entered. As per the plan, Weiss approached Rosen and fired 6 shots directly into his chest. The shopkeeper dropped to the floor. The job was done, but Strauss, either unable to contain himself, or not willing to take orders from another killer, approached the prostrate man and fired 4 more bullets into him. The gunman jumped into the getaway car and made a successful escape. Weiss wasn't happy with Strauss's actions. The following day, when he reported to Lepke, the gang boss asked him how everything went. "Everything is okay," Weiss stated, "only that son of a bitch Pep. I give him strict orders not to do any shooting, but after I shoot Rosen, and he is laying there on the floor, Pep starts shooting him." Lepke wasn't bothered. "What's the difference? As long as everyone is clean and you got away all right." Though unconcerned at the time, little did Lepke and Weiss realize, but this murder would lead both them and Louis Capone, who helped orchestrate the killing, to the electric chair. Little is known about the murder of Justiano. It may have been a personal grudge between the victim and Herman Yon over a woman. But contemporary news reports mention that the victim, who worked as a tailor, had a year previously been arrested for running numbers. Whatever the reason, after parking his car in the early hours of November 18, 1936, Justiano was shot in the head a handful of times. District Attorney notes name Yon and Strauss as the killers. Rudnick was one of the original members of Relis's fledgling gang back in the late 1920s. Like Relis and Strauss, he was a loan shark, but he was also a drug addict. Strauss alerted his Confederates that he had information that Rudnick was talking to a detective. That plus the fact that he was an addict, who when deprived of his drugs would probably say anything for a fix, sealed the deal. Whitey had to go. After a 4-day vigil, Rudnick was sighted slinking down the street. Dasher Abendando picked him up and brought him to a garage where Strauss and Yon were waiting. Once inside, the Dasher held him while Strauss tightened a clothesline around his throat. As he was choking to death, Strauss took out an ice pick and started stabbing. The job complete, Dasher dragged the dead man to the car and pulled him inside as Strauss and Yon lifted his head. Rudnick was too tall, so Dasher bent his legs and pushed him in. In doing this, air was forced from his body, making a coughing-type noise. Assuming that he was still alive, Strauss stabbed him numerous more times. In all there would be 63 stab wounds. Grabbing a meat cleaver, Yon said, "Let me hit this bastard one for luck," before splitting Rudnick's skull with one swing. Walter Sage was one of the boys from Brownsville. A one-time roommate with Strauss, he took part in murders and by the summer of 1937 was managing the gang's slot machine interests in the Catskills. There he lived with Irving Big Gang E. Cohen, who also operated as his second-in-command. That summer Relis, Strauss and the others involved in the slots decided that Sage's accounting did not match their own. It was determined that Sage was ripping off the combination and had to go. Strauss orchestrated the murder while staying upstate. The contract went to Cohen and Jack Drucker, a gang associate who lived and operated in the Catskills with a handful of murders under his belt. One evening around July 20th, Strauss got in touch with Pretty Levine, who was also vacationing at the time, and told him to pick him up at Loch Sheldrake at the Evans Hotel. Pretty showed up and the two sat in his car waiting. Soon another car drove by and flashed its headlights. Strauss directed Levine to follow the car. In the front passenger seat of the car they were tailing sat Walter Sage. In the back seat were Gang E. Cohen and Jack Drucker. Sage wouldn't have considered himself in any danger, both men were his good friends. At a certain point Cohen leaned forward and grabbed Sage around the neck and held him while Drucker pulled out an ice pick and stabbed his associate over 30 times in the neck and chest. The job done, the cars pulled over. Assuming that he might be next on the hit list, Cohen hightailed it into the woods. He eventually made his way to a train station and ended up in California. Back at the murder site, Perplexed by Cohen's behavior, Strauss and Drucker dragged Sage from the car and placed him into Pretty Levine's auto. The dead man was then driven to Swan Lake where Strauss trussed up the corpse with rope. The plan was to disappear him in a lake as they did with Jack Goldstein the previous summer. To this end, a 30-pound rock was tied around Sage's neck, and for extra weight, the metal framing of a pinball machine or a slot machine was lashed to the corpse. Then, like Goldstein, Sage was taken out to the middle of the lake and dumped overboard. His disappearance went unnoticed until 10 days later when his body, bloated by gases, surfaced to the top of the lake and was discovered by vacationers. Once again while vacationing in the Catskills, Strauss was called to duty. It was another job for Lepke. The victim, Herman Yon, was a ranking member of Lepke's organization whom the mob boss decided had to go. On the evening of August 6, 1938, Yon was lured from a cabaret and shot to death in his own car. His killers were Strauss and Allie Tannenbaum. At the time of his murder, the Loch Sheldrake Hotel was having a swimming pool installed. Strauss, Tannenbaum, Jack Drucker and Sholem Bernstein buried the labor racketeer in a quicklime pit nearby the new construction. Whitey Fredman was known as a collector for Lepke. During Dewey's investigation of the crime lord, Fredman was arrested and released on bail. Worried about what he might say if brought to trial, Lepke ordered his removal. The contract went to Strauss. That spring Louis Capone dropped off a shotgun and pistol at Abe Relis's house. Kid Twist sawed off the barrel and gave it to Pep. Assisting Strauss was Seymour Bluejaw Magoon and Mikey Sickoff. Pep and Bluejaw traveled into Manhattan and were met by Allie Tannenbaum, who brought them to a building and pointed out Fredman as he exited. The two killers followed Fredman to the subway and rode back to Brooklyn with him on the same car so they would recognize him when it was time for the kill. On the afternoon of the hit, Mikey Sickoff waited for Fredman outside his office building and rode the subway back with him. Once in Brooklyn, Sickoff got into his car and drove down Freedman Street. While passing a parked car with Magoon at the wheel and Strauss sitting in the rear, he beeped his horn. The signal that Fredman was on his way. A few minutes later they saw Whitey pass. Magoon pulled out into traffic. Approaching the target, Strauss jumped from the car and ran up behind the unwary victim. Placing the sawed-off shotgun inches from Fredman, Strauss pulled the trigger. Pugy was a contract for Albert Anastasia. Feinstein, an ex-boxer, started taking bets in the Borough Park section of Brooklyn. This was the domain of mobster Vincent Mangano, who didn't care for the competition and asked Anastasia to have him removed. The latter gave the contract to Strauss. For a number of weeks, Strauss was unable to locate him. Then, on the evening of September 5, as Strauss, Relis and Goldstein were standing on their corner in Brownsville, a diminutive man with a pug nose walked up and asked them if they knew where a certain loan shark was. They said no, and Feinstein said, "If you see him, tell him Pugy from Borough Park is looking for him." As Pugy walked away, it suddenly hit Pep, this was the guy he had been looking for. A plan was quickly hatched. Goldstein drove Pugy around pretending to look for the loan shark while Strauss and Relis went to the latter's house to prepare for the hit. After about an hour, Goldstein pulled up and ran inside. They were ready. He returned to the car and told Pugy that the man he sought was inside. Once Pugy entered, Strauss grabbed him from behind. Goldstein pummeled the victim while Strauss and Relis tried to get a clothesline around his neck. After a bit of fighting, Strauss managed to tie him up into a ball and the ex-boxer was strangled to death. His body was transported to a dump and set on fire. Seeing the flames, passers-by called the fire department and the grisly murder was discovered. This was the murder the DA used to send both Goldstein and Strauss to the electric chair. A little less than 4 months after Feinstein was killed, a new Brooklyn DA was sworn in and he put one of his assistant district attorneys, Burton Turkis, in charge of clearing up the 200 or so unsolved murders in that borough. On January 2, 1940, Relis, Goldstein and Duke Maffitor were picked up for the killing of Red Alpert on the testimony of Alpert's friend Harry Rudolph. 2 weeks later, Strauss, Happy Mayon and Dasher Abendando were picked up and held on vagrancy charges. When their court date came up, the DA had them arrested for the murder of Daniel Meehan, which kept them behind bars. That was the same month that Maffitor and then Pretty Levine started to sing. Followed by Relis. Within months the country was both horrified and mesmerized by the Murder Inc. trials. Mayon and Abendando were found guilty for the murder of Whitey Rudnick and Goldstein and Strauss for that of Pugy Feinstein. June 12, 1941, it is an hour until midnight. Goldstein has just paid his debt to society and now it is Strauss's turn. He is ushered in and led to the chair. As he is strapped in, a reporter for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle tells us, Pep gazes over the witnesses as an actor looking over a full house. The mask was brought down over his head and at 11:06, the current was tossed. 3 minutes later one of the most prolific and feared killers of gangland was pronounced dead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video please like and consider subscribing. For more on the Amron and Mir killing, check out my video Messed with the Mob.